North Atlantic, April 10th, 1943, 0147 hours. Fog so thick you could lose a ship's mast in it. The sea heaved like molten steel under a moon buried behind clouds. 42 merchant vessels crawled eastward, Convoy HX-233, their wakes glowing faintly in the phosphorescent dark. The sound of diesel engines throbbed through the mist, steady, tired, nervous. Somewhere in the formation's shadow, a destroyer moved like a ghost. USS Rutherford, call sign R-29, one of 4 escorts guarding the line. Her decks glistened with sea spray. The crew had been at battle stations for 4 hours. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Inside the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Jack Kincaid stood hunched over the radar scope, the red glow cutting across his face. He was 35, lean, sleepless, with a permanent squint, earned from too many nights staring through fog and fire. "Contact bearing 217 degrees, the sonar officer said quietly. "Long-range ping. Could be multiple." Kincaid didn't answer right away. He listened to the hum of the engines, the rhythm of the sonar, the ocean's deceptive calm. "Multiple," he repeated. "How many?" "6, maybe 7. Moving fast. Formation pattern." "That's a wolfpack, sir." The bridge went still. The men knew what that meant. The convoy was about to be surrounded. Doctrine said hold formation. Never break away. Never leave the merchants unguarded. The escorts were to circle like sheepdogs, tight, defensive, predictable. But Kincaid had seen too many ships die obeying that rule. Outside, thunder rolled across the water. A tanker up front, SS Rosehaven, erupted into a fireball. The orange flash turned fog to glass. Seconds later, a second explosion. SS Monmouth. The convoy was being hit from both sides. "Orders, sir," the XO shouted. Kincaid's jaw tightened. "Cut engines. Rudder 10 degrees to port." The helmsman hesitated. "Sir, that takes us away from the convoy." "I know what it does. Do it." The Rutherford turned into the fog, engines low. Sonar pings echoing off unseen walls of water. On the radar, the rest of the convoy disappeared behind them. The XO leaned closer. "Sir, this is against protocol." "Protocol's what got Rosehaven sunk." A new sound filled the sonar room. Faint, rhythmic, rising. Propellers. Close. Multiple contacts ahead. Kincaid leaned over the operator's shoulder. "That's them." The sonar man's hand shook slightly. "Bearing 185. Range 2,000 yards. Kincaid exhaled through his teeth. "We've got one shot before they scatter." He grabbed the intercom. "All hands, prepare depth charges pattern Delta. No flares, no lights. We go blind." The crew tensed. Somewhere below them, invisible in the black water, 6 German U-boats were closing in for the kill, and the Rutherford was steaming straight into their jaws. "Sir," the XO said again, his voice low but urgent. "The Admiralty says—" Kincaid cut him off. "The Admiralty's not out here. We are." The first sonar ping came back with a sharp metallic echo. Contact confirmed. "Target acquired," said the operator. Kincaid straightened. His eyes were steady now, calm in the chaos. "Then let's make some noise." The destroyer's engines roared to life. The ship surged forward, slicing the fog open like a blade. Crewmen scrambled to depth charge rails, pulling safety pins, waiting for the order. "Range?" Kincaid barked. 1,000 yards. Closing fast." He nodded once. "Drop." The deck shuddered as steel cylinders plunged into the sea. Seconds later, the night split apart. 1, 2, 3 explosions, blooming underwater like thunder made solid. The bridge lights flickered. Then came the sound every sailor in the Atlantic prayed to hear. A hollow, booming crack from below. A hull breaking. "Direct hit!" The crew erupted, but Kincaid stayed silent. Through the fog, another explosion flared. A second submarine breaching, oil and flame bursting to the surface. He turned to his XO. Signal the convoy. Tell them to keep moving. We'll hold the door. The XO hesitated. Sir, if we stay out here... Kincaid looked back into the fog, his voice quiet but certain. Then they'll come for us instead. And that, he thought, was the point. As dawn began to bleed through the mist, the Rutherford vanished again into the gray. One destroyer alone against the pack, chasing death into silence. The Admiralty would call it madness. History would call it the moment the math changed. Before that night, no one in the Atlantic Fleet would have dared to do what Jack Kincaid did. Never leave the convoy wasn't just a rule. It was gospel. It was the first sentence in the escort commander's handbook, and the last order shouted before every deployment. The logic was simple and old. Convoys survived by staying together tight and quiet. Escorts didn't chase threats. They contained them. The math was defensive. Better to lose a few ships than risk all. That math made sense on paper. But the ocean didn't care about paper. By early 1943, the North Atlantic was a slaughterhouse. The Germans had perfected the wolfpack, U-boats working in groups of 5 to 8, coordinated by encrypted radio bursts from France. They'd wait until the moon was high, pick up convoy engine noise, then converge. Torpedoes would hit from two sides. Panic would do the rest. Doctrine said escorts must circle the convoy in a screen, a wide, predictable arc meant to protect the merchants. The result? The screen became a trap. The escorts were too close to maneuver, too slow to strike, and too cautious to hunt. The U-boats simply sat outside the circle and fired in. Every destroyer captain knew it, but no one wanted to be the first to break faith with the Admiralty. Disobedience meant court-martial. Losing your ship meant disgrace. In the British Navy, honor was measured in discipline. In the American fleet, it was measured in obedience. Kincaid believed both were overrated. He'd seen what following rules looked like. The year before, he'd escorted convoy on 67, 41 ships, 8 sunk in one night. He'd watched flares rise over the water like dying stars. Every order followed, every position held, every rule obeyed. And still the sea was full of bodies. He had stood on the deck as the survivors drifted past, oil black and silent. One had looked up at him and said, "You followed the book, didn't you?" Then he slipped under. That question had never left Kincaid's head. By the time he took command of the Rutherford, the rules no longer looked holy. They looked human, flawed, predictable, written for wars that no longer existed. The convoy manuals were written after World War I, when U-boats hunted alone. Now they hunted like coordinated machines. Never leave the convoy had been written for a slower enemy, a dumber ocean. But in 1943, silence and order were what the wolves expected. And Kincaid hated being expected. He spent nights in the chart room studying U-boat strike patterns, distances between torpedo hits and response times of escort groups. The numbers told him something the Admiralty didn't want to hear. Convoys that held formation lost an average of 22% of their tonnage per attack. Convoys whose escorts pursued aggressively lost under 5%. The data was buried in after-action reports, dismissed as unverified anomalies. Kincaid saw it as proof. He told his XO once, "The Germans have a rhythm, same time, same angle, same approach. They count on us to play our part. All we have to do is stop being predictable." The XO frowned. "Sir, the Admiralty calls that reckless." Kincaid smiled thinly. They also called radar a gimmick, and sonar witchcraft. The men aboard the Rutherford didn't follow Kincaid because of orders. They followed him because he listened to the ocean differently. He treated sonar not as a tool, but as a language. Each ping was a heartbeat, each echo a warning. He knew what the Admiralty didn't, that silence wasn't safety anymore. It was a coffin waiting to be filled. Every escort captain believed his job was to protect the convoy. Kincaid believed his job was to hunt the hunters, and the only way to do that was to do what no one else dared, leave the pack. That was his heresy. The belief that sometimes, to save the many, you had to disobey the few. And when the fog rolled in over HX-233, the night gave him his first chance to prove it. The Battle of the Atlantic was never just about ships. It was about doctrine, the invisible chain that bound men tighter than steel. From the first convoy in 1939 to the Black Winter of 1943, Allied escort strategy was a mirror of the past, cautious, mathematical, obedient. The convoy system had been born in World War I, when U-boats hunted alone and sonar didn't exist. Back then, slow movement and tight formations worked. But by the 1940s, the ocean had changed. The Germans had turned it into an algorithm of destruction. Their wolfpacks weren't improvisations. They were systems. Each U-boat operated in a grid known as a rudel, coordinated by coded Enigma bursts. The moment one sub spotted a convoy, it transmitted a single letter, one flash, one bearing, one target. Within hours, a swarm would converge from miles away. By 1943, a single sighting report could bring 6 to 12 U-boats onto a convoy's path within 10 hours. Allied doctrine had no answer for that kind of speed. The standard escort formation looked perfect on paper. 4 destroyers and 2 corvettes guarding the convoy's edges in a rotating diamond pattern. Each ship was responsible for a sector. Orders were absolute. Maintain position, guard the convoy, respond only to direct sonar contact. The flaw was fatal. Every U-boat commander knew exactly how far each escort could move without leaving a gap. They called it the dead zone, the area between convoy protection limits. They would fire, dive, and reposition into that dead zone, where no escort could legally chase them. Convoy HX-229 had lost 11 ships that way in March. HX-229A lost 9. HX-233 was next in line. That's where Kincaid came in. He wasn't a desk-trained officer. Before the war, he'd been a hunter-killer group instructor, a tactician obsessed with turning defense into offense. He studied torpedo tracks like chess moves, mapped acoustic trails from memory, and practiced attack timing to the second. But every time he submitted an idea, the Admiralty pushed it back with the same stamp, non-doctrinal. His forbidden maneuver, the hard break from convoy formation to pursue sonar contact, had been tested in war games. It worked, but it was rejected for one reason: risk of isolation. That phrase was the curse of innovation in 1943. Risk of isolation meant the captain was thinking too much, moving too far, or daring too boldly. The manuals warned against aggressive, independent action because it disrupted the fleet's harmony. The Admiralty believed in order. Kincaid believed in rhythm. He used to say, "The sea doesn't play fair, so why should we?" The Rutherford was his laboratory. Her crew was young, untested, but willing to gamble. Kincaid trained them not to react, but to anticipate. He had them study wolfpack attack sequences, memorize average reloading times, listen to U-boat screws until they could tell Type 7 from Type 9 just by pitch. His XO called it madness. "Sir, we're sailors, not fortune-tellers." Kincaid had only smiled. "Then let's learn the future." The Rutherford carried 214 depth charges, a single Hedgehog mortar, and a radar set barely reliable in fog. But Kincaid's weapon wasn't ordnance. It was time. He learned that the average wolfpack attack lasted 14 minutes, from first sighting to torpedo impact. If an escort moved faster than that, if it became unpredictable, the Germans couldn't calculate the pattern. He didn't want to guard the convoy. He wanted to break the algorithm. By March 1943, U-boats had sunk over 700,000 tons of shipping in 6 weeks. The ocean belonged to Germany. The convoys were moving coffins. Kincaid intended to change that, not with better equipment, not with luck, but with a single act of tactical blasphemy: move before the enemy fires. In the Admiralty's eyes, that was arrogance. In the Atlantic, it was evolution. The men who survived those nights said later, You could always tell when Kincaid was on watch. The ocean got quiet, like it was waiting to see what he'd do next. Every commander in the Atlantic carried a map, but Jack Kincaid carried numbers. He trusted the ocean to lie and arithmetic to tell the truth. The numbers were merciless. Between January and March 1943, the height of the U-boat war, Allied convoys lost over 120 merchant ships, nearly 700,000 tons of cargo, and 6,000 sailors. Most of those deaths followed the same pattern: hit, panic, silence. The Germans weren't winning with luck. They were winning with timing. Every wolfpack followed a rhythm. The first U-boat sighted the convoy at dusk, radioed the bearing to headquarters. By nightfall, the rest moved into attack position. Their torpedoes fired from an average distance of 2,000 meters, always in salvos of 2 or 3. The escorts responded within 5 minutes, but by then the subs had already changed depth, relocated, and fired again. It wasn't warfare. It was mathematics performed in blood. Doctrine said destroyers should stay within 2,500 yards of the convoy, a safety radius designed to deter single U-boats. But against a wolfpack, it turned escorts into stationary targets. U-boats simply moved around the formation, attacking from blind angles. In one convoy after another, the escort's perfect discipline produced perfectly predictable deaths. Kincaid saw it all laid out in after-action reports. The patterns were so consistent they might as well have been drawn by compass. He started charting the timings. Average delay between torpedo hit and escort response, 3.2 minutes. Average time for a U-boat to reposition after firing, 2.7 minutes. Average distance traveled during that window, 1,200 yards. That gap, those 1,200 yards, was where every ship died. The Admiralty's solution was to add more escorts. Kincaid's solution was to change the geometry. He realized that if one destroyer abandoned its position and ran perpendicular to the convoy's course, cutting across the torpedo tracks instead of chasing them, it could break the German formation entirely. The trick wasn't to attack the submarine that fired, but to intercept the others before they had time to coordinate. He called it the cross-pattern strike. The Admiralty called it suicide. To them, leaving the convoy perimeter meant losing the convoy. To Kincaid, it meant giving it a future. He tested the math in secret with his crew, running simulations between patrols. The model worked every time. One destroyer acting unpredictably cut the probability of a successful U-boat salvo by over 60%. He knew the flaw in Doctrine wasn't lack of strength. It was repetition. Every escort captain reacted the same way at the same time to the same sound. The wolfpacks had turned that consistency into a weapon. He told his XO one night, "You can't outgun the sea, but you can confuse it." The XO shook his head. "Sir, confusion gets men killed." Kincaid stared out into the mist, voice calm. "So does predictability." He calculated further. In an average convoy of 40 ships, even saving 2 meant 10,000 tons of supplies, food, ammunition, steel, enough to keep 2 divisions alive for a week. Every second mattered. Every rule slowed them down. By now, U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Every convoy that left Halifax carried not just cargo, but arithmetic. How long before we're found? How many will make it? Who will die first? Kincaid wanted to change the equation. If the enemy expected silence, he would make noise. If the enemy expected order, he would make chaos. The ocean wasn't a chessboard anymore. It was a roulette table. The Germans kept betting on patterns. Kincaid was about to spin the wheel. He looked at the charts, the timings, the endless lines of loss, and made one final note in his log. To survive, the convoy must become unpredictable. To win, we must stop playing by their math. The next night, the ocean gave him a chance to prove it. April 10th, 1943, 02:23 hours. The fog lay thick as cement. Convoy HX-233 crawled east through the North Atlantic, its formation tight, slow, and terrified. 42 merchant ships, 5 escorts. The wolfpack was closing from the southwest. 7 contacts confirmed. Inside USS Rutherford, every man waited for the sound that would decide whether they lived or drowned. The sonar room hummed. Contact bearing 210 degrees, range 2,000 yards, moving fast. Kincaid leaned over the display. "That's not one sub," he murmured. "That's 3. He stood upright. "All engines ahead flank. Rudder 30 degrees to starboard." The XO looked up sharply. "Sir, that'll take us out of escort perimeter." "I'm aware," Kincaid said. "Hold the line. We're cutting across the formation." The destroyer lurched forward, engines howling. Waves crashed against the bow as Rutherford tore through the mist. The convoy vanished from radar behind them. Every sailor on the bridge knew they'd just broken the cardinal rule, leaving the herd. "Depth charges ready?" "Aye, sir." "Pattern Delta 1. Fuse delay 3 seconds. The sonar operator called out again, voice trembling. "Contact closing. Bearing 210. Range 1,200 yards. Kincaid didn't flinch. "Steady. They'll fire in 30 seconds. We go before they do." "Before, sir," the XO said. "We don't have their position exact." Kincaid cut him off. "That's the point. They think they're timing us. Let's ruin their clock." The destroyer cut its engines. The sudden silence was deafening. For 5 seconds, the Atlantic was still. Then Kincaid barked, "Hard port! Drop pattern now!" 12 depth charges rolled off the stern and plunged into the sea. The explosions hit seconds later. Deep, muffled, concussive. The ship rocked as if struck by a hammer. The water erupted behind them in columns of white and black. "Sonar! Report! Contact! Contact! 1 gone, sir. 1 fading. 1 moving to flank speed bearing 185. "They're trying to scatter," Kincaid said. "Exactly what we want." The XO looked at him, disbelief mixing with awe. "You planned this?" "Not planned," Kincaid said. "Predicted." He grabbed the voice tube. "All ahead full. Ready port launchers. Depth charge reload pattern echo." The destroyer surged forward again, slicing the waves. Another echo, this one sharper, closer. "Second sub at 400 yards. Stand by to ram if necessary," Kincaid ordered. The helmsman hesitated. "Sir, don't blink." Through the mist, a gray fin broke the surface, the conning tower of a German Type 7, barely 50 yards off their bow. The sub's crew scrambled to dive, hatches slamming. "Now!" Kincaid shouted. The Rutherford struck. The impact was bone-shattering. Steel on steel, followed by a roar as depth charges detonated just beneath the sub's hull. Flames erupted from the sea. Pieces of the conning tower scattered across the water like shrapnel. "Sub breaking up," the sonar operator yelled. "Direct hit confirmed." The bridge erupted in shouts, but Kincaid raised a hand. "We're not done." "Sir?" They never hunt alone. A second sonar return appeared, then a third. The rest of the pack was converging, drawn by the chaos. By what they thought was a wounded destroyer. "Prepare forward launchers, hedgehog pattern. Fire on bearing 215. The Rutherford turned into the oncoming line, guns elevated, sonar pings filling the air. The hedgehog mortars fired, 24 small projectiles arcing into the fog. 10 seconds later, a series of rapid explosions answered back. "Contact destroyed!" The men cheered again. But this time, it wasn't wild relief. It was disbelief. In less than 8 minutes, Kincaid's forbidden turn had done what 3 years of Doctrine hadn't, disrupted an entire wolf pack. The convoy, still miles behind, reported no further torpedo strikes. The XO leaned on the chart table, breathless. "Sir, you just rewrote the book." Kincaid didn't look up from the radar. His voice was calm, almost detached. "No," he said. I just stopped reading it." He watched the sonar sweep spin again. Empty this time. The ocean had gone silent. Somewhere in that silence, Kincaid knew the Admiralty's Doctrine was sinking right alongside the U-boats. He took a slow breath and said, almost to himself, "Let them call it luck. The sea knows better." By sunrise, the Atlantic was calm again. A gray sheet of metal stretching to the horizon, hiding everything it had just devoured. The USS Rutherford drifted at reduced speed, her hull scorched, rails twisted, decks slick with oil and salt. Smoke curled faintly from her funnels. She had faced 7 U-boats and was still afloat. The convoy behind her, by 42 merchant ships, was intact. Not one lost after the initial 2. The Rutherford's engines groaned, her crew working like ghosts. Burned hands, bloodied knuckles, red-rimmed eyes. But no one complained. They'd seen what disobedience could do. In the sonar room, the operator whispered, "They're gone. No returns. It's clear." Kincaid stared at the radar scope. A blank circle glowing red in the dark. For the first time in months, it was empty. "Convoy status?" he asked. "Green across the board," said the XO, still stunned. "Not even stragglers." "Sir, it worked." Kincaid didn't smile. "No, it survived." He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, exhaled slowly, and watched the smoke twist upward. The rulebook said what he'd done was insubordination. The sea had given him its own verdict: survival. By noon, reports began spreading through the convoy radio network. Rutherford engaged Wolfpack. 5 subs destroyed or driven off. Convoy intact. By evening, 3 other escort captains had tried variations of Kincaid's maneuver. 2 succeeded. 1, HMS Truro, failed, losing her bow in a collision after chasing too far. But the message was clear. The convoy screen could move, could strike, could hunt. The math of the Atlantic began to change. Within a week, Allied intelligence noted a 40% drop in successful U-boat attacks in that sector. The wolfpacks were disoriented, their timing shattered, their coordination disrupted. Admiral Donitz himself would later call April 1943 the beginning of the decline. It wasn't radar, it wasn't numbers. It was unpredictability. For years, both sides had worshipped Doctrine. Now, one man's defiance had turned improvisation into a weapon. Kincaid's report, filed under Operational Anomaly HX-233, arrived at Fleet Headquarters 3 days later. The summary was 1 line long. Convoy survived due to independent offensive action contrary to standing escort doctrine. The Admiralty circled that sentence in red. Contrary meant dangerous. Independent meant unacceptable. And yet, they couldn't ignore the results. The data was undeniable. Average convoy loss per crossing dropped from 1 in 9 to 1 in 40 within 2 months. Average U-boat kill ratio tripled when escorts maneuvered outside standard formation. The Atlantic War's tonnage loss curve, steady for 3 years, suddenly bent downward. Kincaid's forbidden turn had become a ghost doctrine. Captains passed it by word of mouth, code names whispered between ships. Cross pattern, Kincaid's cut, Rutherford's dance. No manuals, no signatures, just a quiet rebellion spreading like a current through the fleet. For the first time, the wolfpacks couldn't calculate what the enemy would do next, and the Germans hated what they couldn't calculate. Intercepted U-boat transmissions told the story. Convoy escorts behaving erratically. Destroyers leaving formation. Unpredictable counterstrikes. Cannot determine attack rhythm. To Donitz, it looked like madness. To Kincaid, it looked like freedom. When a junior officer asked if he feared punishment for breaking orders, Kincaid only said, "If the Admiralty wants to hang me, they can, but they'll hang me under a sky we kept free." The collapse of Doctrine wasn't loud. It didn't happen with headlines or ceremonies. It happened in the silence between pings, in the space where men stopped obeying and started thinking. The wolfpacks had fed on Allied predictability. Now, they were choking on uncertainty. Kincaid hadn't just saved a convoy. He'd infected an entire navy with something dangerous. Initiative. That spring, the sea itself seemed to change tone. The old rhythm of fear, ping, pause, explosion, was gone. In its place came something sharper, faster, alive. The rhythm of men who had finally learned that obedience was not courage. Because in the Atlantic of 1943, survival no longer belonged to those who followed the book. It belonged to the ones willing to tear it in half. April 22nd, 1943. 2 weeks after HX-233. Another convoy, ONS-7, was threading its way across the gray Atlantic. 40 ships, heavy with steel, grain, and fuel. The same route, the same risk. But this time, everyone had heard of Kincaid. The story of the Rutherford had traveled faster than any radio signal. Officers whispered about the captain who turned into the torpedoes. The Admiralty had not endorsed the maneuver, but they hadn't forbidden it either. The silence itself was permission. Now, with ONS-7 under attack, Kincaid was about to test his luck again. It was 1 o'clock hours when sonar picked up multiple contacts, 5 U-boats moving in a fan pattern from the southwest. The convoy tightened formation automatically. The escorts, 4 destroyers, 1 corvette, prepared to hold position. Kincaid stood at the chart table, cigarette burning low between his fingers. "Same formation, same tactic," he muttered. "They'll expect us to circle." The XO, Lieutenant Harris, frowned. "Sir, you can't be thinking." "I am. Last time we got lucky." Kincaid gave a thin smile. "Then let's be lucky twice." He turned to the helmsman. "Engines ahead 2/3, rudder 20 degrees to starboard. Prepare for cross-pattern advance." The helmsman blinked. "Sir, that's the turn." "That's the turn," Kincaid said. The Rutherford broke formation again, sliding out from the convoy screen and vanishing into the fog. Over the radio, another escort captain's voice crackled. "Rutherford, return to position. Repeat, return to—" Kincaid cut the radio off. "They'll thank us later." The sonar operator spoke softly. "Contacts converging. 3 ahead, 2 trailing. Closest at 1,500 yards. Ready depth charges, pattern Bravo. Set proximity fuses." The destroyer accelerated. Kincaid could almost feel the rhythm of the hunt now. The U-boats rising and falling in unison, timing their torpedo spreads to the convoy's course. He wasn't going to wait for them to fire. "Sonar," Kincaid said. "Mark the strongest ping. Bearing 185. Helm hard to port. Drop pattern Bravo. 2-second delay." The destroyer banked sharply, engines roaring. Depth charges splashed off the stern, their fuses ticking in the dark. "Brace!" The ocean erupted. 6 detonations in quick succession. Thundering booms, the deck shaking, lights flickering. Then a second rumble, lower and deeper. The unmistakable sound of steel collapsing under pressure. "One sub breaking up!" the sonar operator shouted. Kincaid exhaled slowly. "That's one." Another echo flared on the screen. A second U-boat was surfacing, trying to escape the depth charge pattern. "Surface contact, range 400 yards. Helm, close distance, forward guns, target conning tower." The 5-inch gun on the bow thundered, the muzzle flash blinding in the fog. The shell hit square, sparks, smoke and fire bursting from the U-boat's deck. Men tumbled into the freezing water. "Target destroyed." The XO looked at the sonar screen. 2 blips gone, 3 scattering. "The rest are running." "They won't get far," Kincaid said. "Signal Halifax and Drayton. Sweep sectors 180 through 220. Hit them while they're diving." Moments later, 2 more destroyers entered the fray. The sea shook with explosions. Columns of mist rose and fell like the ocean itself was breathing. Then, silence. The sonar pinged once, twice, then nothing. "Contacts lost," the operator whispered. Kincaid rubbed his temples, exhaustion finally showing through. That's the idea. Within 30 minutes, ONS-7 was clear. 40 ships untouched, 5 U-boats sunk or crippled. The wolfpack had been shattered again, by disobedience, precision, and instinct. At dawn, as the convoy reformed, a British captain hailed over radio. "Rutherford, confirm number of contacts destroyed." Kincaid replied, "5, give or take a Doctrine." There was laughter over the line, the kind of laughter that carried relief, awe, and disbelief all at once. For the rest of the crossing, the wolfpack stayed silent. Not a single sonar ping returned. Kincaid wrote his after-action report in one line. "They expected fear. We gave them movement." That report was classified, but copies spread like wildfire. Captains began drawing circles and arrows on maps, studying the Rutherford's movements. The forbidden turn was no longer rumor. It was revolution. That spring, every escort captain in the North Atlantic learned the same truth. The ocean doesn't reward the obedient. It rewards the bold. And Jack Kincaid had just given them permission to be both. May 1943. Liverpool Naval Command. The war room smelled of tobacco, cold tea, and sleeplessness. Maps of the North Atlantic covered the walls. Grids of red and blue pins marking convoys and sinkings. A cluster of officers stood around a long oak table while rain beat against the windows. At the head sat Vice Admiral Bertram Lowe, stiff-backed, precise, the kind of man who believed the war could be won with neat handwriting and flawless formations. In front of him lay a report stamped HX-233, ONS-7, USS Rutherford, unauthorized maneuver. Lowe's brow furrowed. 2 engagements, both contrary to standing orders. 1 ship operating outside convoy perimeter. Results, anomalously successful. "Anomalously?" said a young aide, smirking. "Sir, they destroyed 7 U-boats in 2 weeks. "That's precisely what concerns me," Lowe replied. "Success achieved by disorder invites collapse." Across the table, a Royal Navy liaison officer muttered, "With respect, Admiral, the collapse seems to be happening to the other side." Lowe's glare silenced him. "Doctrine exists for a reason. If every captain thinks he's a hero, we'll have chaos from here to Halifax." But outside that room, chaos was already winning and saving lives. The Rutherford Turn had spread across the Atlantic faster than the Admiralty could issue reprimands. Destroyer captains from Canada to Iceland were performing aggressive cross patterns, chasing sonar echoes beyond the official perimeter. Convoy loss rates were plummeting, from 1 ship in 9 to 1 in 40. Lowe issued an immediate directive. All escort captains are reminded that deviation from convoy formation is strictly prohibited. The next day, 3 destroyers ignored it. That same week, Convoy HX-233 reached Liverpool with all 47 ships intact, not a single loss. Every escort captain credited the maneuver Kincaid had invented. The Admiralty could silence a man, but not a result. 2 weeks later, Kincaid was summoned to headquarters. He arrived still smelling of sea salt, his uniform salt-stained and patched, his expression unreadable. In the boardroom, Admiral Lowe read from a prepared statement. "Lieutenant Commander Jack Kincaid, your actions in Convoy HX-233 and ONS-7 constitute gross disobedience of standing escort protocol. Do you have anything to say before formal reprimand?" Kincaid stared at him. "Yes, sir." "How many convoys made it through in April?" Lowe hesitated. 38. "How many the month before that?" 26. Kincaid nodded. "Then maybe we can afford the reprimand." A few officers suppressed smiles. Lowe leaned forward. "You think yourself above doctrine?" Kincaid's voice was calm, steady. "No, sir. I think doctrine's supposed to serve the men, not the other way around." Silence hung in the room. Outside, the rain drummed harder against the glass. Finally, Lowe said, "You're relieved of command. Effective immediately." Kincaid saluted, expression unreadable. "Aye, sir." He turned and walked out. No one spoke. Word reached the fleet within 48 hours. They called it the Admiralty's mistake. Officers wrote Rutherford's dance on the walls of wardrooms. The maneuver became legend, not an order, but a rumor with teeth. By June, even the British corvettes were using it. By July, the Canadian escorts had built new training drills around it. And by August, something remarkable happened. The U-boat campaign collapsed. Allied loss rates fell 80% in 90 days. The wolfpacks disintegrated. Admiral Dönitz withdrew his subs from the North Atlantic, admitting defeat. When the news reached Liverpool, Admiral Lowe read the message in silence. Then, quietly, he said, "Find Kincaid." But Kincaid was gone. He'd boarded a supply ship home 2 weeks earlier, stripped of his command, his record sealed. The men of the Rutherford sent a single telegram to his home in Maine. "Convoys safe, ocean quiet. You were right." No reply ever came. Years later, when the archives opened, historians found something peculiar. A tactical bulletin issued in late 1943, unsigned but marked 73C, Cross-Pattern Counterattack Protocol. It was Kincaid's maneuver, word for word. The Admiralty had buried his name and canonized his rebellion. The doctrine that had drowned thousands was gone. In its place stood the math of movement, chaos as protection, unpredictability as law. And the destroyer that once disobeyed orders had given birth to the strategy that ended the Battle of the Atlantic. In the ledger of war, Jack Kincaid's punishment was written in ink, his victory in silence. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer the graveyard it had been. The wolfpacks were starving, their fuel lines cut, their commanders exhausted and afraid. Convoys began crossing unmolested. The ocean that once swallowed ships now seemed eerily still. Historians would later call it Black May, the month the U-boats died. But for the men who lived it, the death had begun the night one destroyer turned against orders and found a new rhythm in the fog. Jack Kincaid never spoke publicly again. He refused interviews, declined medals, and avoided reunions. When asked why, he simply said, "The sea doesn't need witnesses." But his name lived on in ways paper couldn't record. In mess halls from Halifax to Reykjavik, sailors still told the story. How one captain broke the rules and saved a convoy. How a single turn in the mist became a doctrine that changed the war. Official reports buried him under bureaucracy. Tactical Bulletin 73C, distributed in December 1943, read like a technical manual. Cross-pattern engagement, recommended in conditions of limited visibility and multiple sonar contacts. Not one mention of Rutherford or her captain. But every officer knew who had written that chapter in salt water and defiance. The results spoke louder than any commendation. In 6 months, U-boat kills rose 300%. Merchant ship losses dropped by 80%. Convoy tonnage arriving safely to Britain tripled. The war's greatest threat had been beaten not by more guns, but by one man's willingness to ignore the book. Doctrine had drowned thousands. Disobedience had saved millions of tons of food, fuel, and men who would go on to fight in Sicily, Normandy, and the skies above Germany. Kincaid's forbidden turn proved something the Admiralty could never print. That in modern war, the weapon isn't always steel, but thought. In the Naval Academy years later, instructors used his maneuver as a case study. They called it adaptive aggression. They called it fluid command. None dared call it what it really was. Mutiny that worked. Some said Kincaid was lucky. Others said reckless. The truth, as always, was quieter. He simply understood that the ocean punishes hesitation. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won by ships or numbers. It was won by the few who stopped waiting for permission. The men who learned that sometimes the shortest distance between life and death is the one rule you refuse to follow. When the Rutherford's decommissioned hull was scrapped in 1946, a sailor salvaged her brass nameplate and mailed it to Kincaid. No return address, no note, just the name, scarred and salt-stained. He kept it on his wall for the rest of his life. No medals, no speeches, just the name of the ship that proved the sea could be taught new rules. In the quiet arithmetic of history, that's how legends survive, not through orders followed, but through courage multiplied by disobedience. And when the ocean finally went silent, it was because men like Kincaid had taught it to listen. The North Atlantic looks peaceful now, cold, endless, still. Cargo ships cross without escort. Radar hums where once men strained to hear sonar pings in the dark. The sea forgets, but the numbers don't. In 1943, Allied convoys lost one ship for every 9 that sailed. By the spring of 1944, after the Rutherford's gambit became Doctrine, that number fell to 1 in 40. A war that once devoured 700,000 tons of Allied shipping a month had been reduced to less than 80,000. The wolfpacks had been declawed not by better weapons, but by one act of intelligent defiance. Jack Kincaid never returned to sea after his dismissal. He bought a house on the coast of Maine, where the wind smelled like salt and pine. His neighbors said he'd walk the beach at dawn, stop, and stare at the horizon like he was listening for something only he could hear. When asked what he missed most about command, he answered, "The sound." "What sound?" someone asked. He smiled faintly. "The one right before the depth charges hit, when every man's breath stopped, and all you could hear was the ocean deciding." In the archives, his name is barely a footnote, buried in an appendix. But every destroyer that sails today carries part of him, in the way captains think, move, and disobey when the rules fail to keep up. The Rutherford's maneuver became the foundation for modern convoy tactics from Korea to the Persian Gulf. Every time a ship breaks formation to hunt instead of hide, it's a whisper of Kincaid's ghost, the voice that says, "Don't wait, move first." War remembers its heroes in medals and monuments. The sea remembers them in silence. And somewhere out there, where sonar once pinged through black water, the rhythm of Kincaid's defiance still echoes, a single heartbeat that changed the odds for everyone who followed. It wasn't strategy that saved those men. It was instinct. It wasn't doctrine that turned the tide. It was doubt. The moment a man looked at the rule book, then at the fog, and said, "No." The Battle of the Atlantic ended in statistics and surrender, but it began to turn the night one destroyer vanished into mist and came back alone. Because sometimes history isn't written by the victors or the visionaries. It's written by the man who turned left when everyone else was told to stay the course, and by doing so, made the world right again.